Welcome, everyone. My name is John Kagia, and I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer with New Frontier Data, and I couldn't be more delighted to have you joining us for our latest conversation about the cannabis-infused product market. We have seen, stimulated in part by the extraordinary kind of disruptions to both our social and economic markets caused by COVID, a resurging interest and opportunity being built around cannabis-infused products. And so in partnership with SōRSE Technology, we've been focused over the past few months in better understanding both the innovation, technology, science, and opportunity that's advancing this high growth market, but also working with SōRSE to understand how innovators, entrepreneurs, businesses, and brands can get from the idea of a product to getting something onto retail shelves. And that's what we're going to be focused on today, is in light of all of the trends we have seen in this phenomenally rapidly growing market, how does one get a product from concept to commercialization? So a quick overview of our agenda for today's webinar. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll have our very, very esteemed guest, Michael Flemmens. I'll give him a chance to introduce himself. And I think you'll be very, very excited to hear the perspective that he brings to the conversation that we're going to hear today. For those of you who have attended our webinars before, you know that we always do a poll at the beginning of the webinar, both to understand who we have joining us today and get your take on some of the key issues around the topic we're going to be discussing here. So we'll do that in a couple of minutes, and then we'll get into the heart of the conversation. As we do, we'll spend the first 40 minutes or so walking through the key themes on the development and commercialization of the product, and then we'll open up the floor to questions. But don't wait until the last 20 minutes to pop your questions. In your user interface, you should see a Q&A interface. Please pop in there and start seeding your questions now, because one of the things I'm going to be doing as we go through this conversation is I'll be following the questions as they come in and weaving them into our conversation. So as your questions come up, please place them into the Q&A chat, and we'll make sure to try and get through as many of them as we can. Second, we're not going to be taking any audio questions here. So I know some of you prefer to kind of raise your hand and get called on, but because of the number of attendees that we're expecting, and we're expecting a really big crowd today, I think it's going to be much more efficient if everyone can just use the Q&A interface to make sure that we can get your questions heard. Third piece of housekeeping, we tend to get asked this a lot. Everyone who has registered for this webinar will get access to both the recording and a copy of the deck. So don't feel like you need to scribble furiously to capture everything that we're going to be discussing here. You'll always have access to the playback recording, which should land shortly after we're done with the session. So with that, let's get started. As I said, my name is John Kagia. I am the Chief Knowledge Officer with New Frontier Data. And in that capacity, I lead the phenomenal research team here at New Frontier Data that produces and publishes the research, data, market analytics, and critically market insights on the size, growth, and trajectory of the legal cannabis market. We have been doing this now for, 6 years, which both feels like it has gone by in a flash and feels like it has been a lifetime, given how much the industry has evolved over the past 6 years. And it has been an extraordinary privilege to watch categories like the infused product market emerge from being, a minuscule part of the overall product market, a product market that used to be dominated by flower, to becoming a real force, not just in terms of share of wallet, share of sales, but really share of experience. And we were just talking before the session began about how dynamically in this COVID environment, infused products have provided a different way in which consumers can interface with cannabis, particularly given the concerns around COVID. And so we view our mission and mandate as casting a spotlight, rigorously researching, and providing decision makers the actionable insights and intelligence that they need to make better informed decisions in this phenomenally dynamic market. And so from that context, as Chief Knowledge Officer, that's a framework, that's the perspective I'll be bringing in to the conversation that we'll be having with Michael today. And so with that, I am delighted, absolutely delighted to introduce Michael Flemmens, who's a VP of Technical Business Development with SōRSE Technology. Michael, please introduce yourself to the group and tell them a bit about what innovation SōRSE is bringing to this infused product market space.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Happy to be part of it. SōRSE as a company was founded a number of years ago. Initially, the primary focus was on creating water-based or water emulsified cannabinoids, specifically for the THC market. As the market has evolved, branched out from THC, the technology we say is agnostic to the starting materials or the material of interest. So the technology doesn't care if it's a THC molecule or a CBD molecule or an adaptogen like ashwagandha or turmeric or ginseng, something like that. So the base technology that SōRSE employs is to take functional ingredients that are, in this case, mostly around oils, and wanting to drag them into water-based platforms. Or in addition to that, there are some of these compounds that do not necessarily bring with them the nicest or kindest of sensory profiles. So it's a double-edged sword of it's an oil and it tastes bad, and I'd really like to put it in my product. And that's sort of the challenge that we took on, and that's essentially the platform of technology that we created.
Great. And could you just tell them a bit about your background? Because I think it's great for them to understand the depth of expertise that you bring into this conversation.
Sure. I've spent, I don't know, 23, 25 years, something like that. I don't keep track. Essentially in regulated markets, whether those regulated markets were medical device or pharmaceuticals, veterinary foods and feeds, and then the food ingredient space. So all four primary silos of the FDA. I spent my career developing products, understanding regulations, always first and foremost, customer is keeping the customer safe. So putting a healthy, safe product in front of whether it be an end user, a CPG company, a beverage manufacturing company, or just as a straight ingredient itself.
Great. So for our attendees, I hope you can appreciate that he's been doing this in a lot of other spaces for a long time, and I challenge you to stump our expert here because broadly speaking, it sounds like he's done it all. So quick segue into our audience poll question. You should see the poll questions appear on your screen now. And we have 4 poll questions here where we're going to be asking what areas of the value chain you're involved in, which infused product categories that you expect to see the most growth in 2020, what impact do you think the pandemic is going to have on demand for infused products, and then what you think the most important factor is when developing a new product. So the poll's up on screen. Please go ahead and get started voting. We'll have this up for, let's say, about 90 seconds. Thank you for all of you who have already responded. For the rest, please go ahead and just take a couple of seconds. These don't take long, but it'll help us make sure that we're steering the conversation in the right way, and then we'll share the responses with you as we get further through the discussion today. and I know I say this every time, but the novelty of seeing the data coming in real time never wears off. So thank you for those who've participated, and thank you in advance for those who are a little slow off the mark. I'll give this maybe another 30 seconds or so. Great diversity of attendees today. So for those of you who are already done with your polling, if you are starting to think up questions, things that you might want to ask Michael as you try and stump the chump, please, or stump the champ, please take the chance to populate that into the Q&A box. So thank you very much for everyone who participated in that. We'll be sharing the results of the poll a little later in the conversation. But now let's get into the heart of this, because I'm really excited about this. So cannabis infused products, navigating the complexities from concepts to commercialization. And before we get started, just want to make sure that everyone is clear that everything we're going to be discussing here is covered in the report that we've had the privilege of producing with SōRSE and our partners that explores this issue of getting a product from concepts to commercialization. The report is available for download at newfrontieردata.com/equio. And just a special appreciation to the SōRSE team for being such phenomenal partners through this process. The kind of guidance that they gave us on the technical aspects of product development, what they've been seeing from the clients that they work with, I think has been really invaluable in helping us better understand this ecosystem, as well as put this into the context of the broader market trends that we're tracking. So get your copy of the report at newfrontieردata.com/equio. So with that, the expanding world of cannabis infused products. And for those of you who may be new to this ecosystem, just to be clear, when we talk about cannabis infused products, we're really broadly speaking about three types of product categories. So one are the solid edibles, which have come a very, very, very long way from the infused brownies that some folks used to eat when they were in college. To really sophisticated and elegant profiles. Gummies have become infused. Gummies have become a really, really major category, but you've got everything from pretzels to popcorn to pet foods and mixed powdered drinks. It's a really, really diversified ecosystem. We're also talking about liquid products, and I think that's going to be a big part of the conversation that we have today. So infused beverages, which actually historically, to Michael's point earlier, used to be very challenging to do because when you're mixing cannabis oils with water-based liquid, the mixing just doesn't work very well. It's oil and water. So the innovations being advanced by companies like SōRSE have made it possible to create really elegant, really sophisticated, both product concepts as well as flavor profiles. And that's one of the things we're going to be getting to today. And then the third spectrum of infused products that we're talking about are topicals. And topicals, generally things that are applied on the skin. And here we're not just talking about things like pain gels or patches, but we're also talking about things like cosmetics. And we've seen huge innovation around things like CBD infused cosmetics as that market begins to embrace the additive benefits of having a compound like CBD in a skincare regimen. So three broad product pillars, but all relevant to the conversation we're going to be having here today. Michael, anything to add there?
Nope, I think you covered it well.
Okay. So important to understand the scale of the market opportunity that we're talking about when we talk about the infused product category. We have seen this dramatic evolution in legal cannabis markets as when states like Colorado and Washington, Oregon first legalized, flower was the predominant product which was being consumed in those markets. And there you were talking about 85% plus of all sales were flower-based. But in this really narrow timeframe, in the 6 years since Colorado legalized, you've seen the share of flower fall to about 50%. Nationally, it's sitting around 56%. But as the share of flower has fallen, you've seen the rise of these other product categories, concentrates, vapes, and edibles. So we're now at a point where edibles, both edibles and topicals, so these infused products, now account for about 14% of sales, which, based on our estimates for what the total national market in 2019 was at $14 billion, it means that edibles accounted for a $2 billion market. And over the next 5 years, between 2020 and 2025, that market will represent, at a minimum, a nearly $22 billion market opportunity. So given the scale of the opportunity this represents, I think it's understandable that you have so many brands, so many innovators looking at this space and realizing that this is a wealth creation opportunity within this broader, significant cannabis evolving legal market. So Michael, I'd love your perspective, particularly as somebody who is coming in from other regulated markets into cannabis, kind of what the trajectory of this market opportunity, how it influenced your thinking about coming into cannabis, and what you've seen and how it reflects with other sectors you've worked in.
Sure, it's a really interesting perspective. As states legalized, the major appeal, but not the only one, but one of the major draws was for the user of cannabis that was already an experienced user of cannabis. And so that's what drove the predominance of flower and your more traditional product lines. But as people became aware and thought about trying different types of products, it's a lot to ask someone who's never consumed any form of cannabis to go into a shop and purchase flower and smoke, especially if they're not smokers. So this avenue, this new market segment of, we'll call them canna-curious folks, that are wanted to try products, get into the market, see what it's all about. Smoke, whether it's flower or vape, sometimes doesn't appeal to those folks. And they also are interested in looking at lower dose products. And it's very hard to control the dose that you get from inhalation. So for those primary reasons, I think you're seeing these subcategories grow, is that folks are curious, they're interested in exploring the market, but they're also looking for some way to control the dosage that they get. And I think those are the biggest drivers for the rise and the growth in the edibles platforms.
Completely agree. And I think as we look at, so if we look across the US right now, about 10% of adults say they consume cannabis regularly. I think that's going to inch up a little over the next couple of years, but broadly speaking, 1 in 10 American adults say they consume cannabis regularly. As we look at that 90% who are non-consumers, I think, to Michael's point, the opportunity for them to interface with cannabis is much more likely going to be happening with non-combustibles than it is going to be happening with combustibles. And key to them being more receptive to trying these products isn't just going to be the shift in public attitudes that we're seeing, but it is also going to be fueled by the product forms. And as you see the innovation that is happening in the infused product category, I think you have a lot more products that look a lot more enticing, a lot more interesting than what we first saw when we first came into the space 6 years ago. So let's talk about defining a customer. You know, the old business or marketing adage about know thy customer. You know, before you do anything in the product development realm, understand who your customer is intended to be. And so we kind of frame this as, before you start building an infused cannabis product, you have to understand kind of who is your intended consumer and why are they going to consume that product. What sort of factors are going to influence the product purchase decision, but also their use case. You know, what are the sort of preferences or behaviors that are going to define their experience as an infused product consumer? And then how will their consumption habits shape the demand for the product that you're trying to build? And by that, we mean, you know, for example, is this something that is going to be consumed really only on special occasions? Or is this something that's intended to be a daily use product or a multi-time a day use product? All of these are things you have to think deeply about before you begin the product development process, because that's going to significantly influence the trajectory of the product development process around what you include in the product, what form it takes, how you distribute it, etc. So it's going to be central to understanding your product strategy. And we've just kind of given 3 examples here of products that I think represent a good spectrum of the cannabinoid consumer. On the one hand, you have a brand like Mad Tasty, which is really fun. I mean, one of their products is called Unicorn Tears. You know, they've taken this really irreverent, fun approach, primarily aimed at younger consumers, and you see that in everything about the brand ethos. You have a product like Champions and Legends. It's CBD infused product aimed at athletes and has been founded by ultra athletes. For those of you who are familiar with Game of Thrones, the Mountain from Game of Thrones, who's also one of the world's greatest powerlifters, is one of the founders of this company. And you can see in everything about the positioning of the brand, its focus on this kind of hyper athletic consumer. And then you have Can, which is a product that is squarely aimed at the alcohol market. And I love their marketing. The Instagram is just an absolute riot, but you can see from the way they think about the consumer that they're aimed at kind of that young, fun-loving, kind of happy hour, socially connected crowd. And their use of memes is fantastic, but it also gives you an illustration of who they're aimed at. So Michael, you know, you've worked with a lot of clients, you've worked with a lot of folks who are trying to build products in this space. What's been your experiences in the way some of your clients are thinking about who their intended customer is going to be, or going through this process of defining their market?
Yeah, it's really interesting to watch as brands and companies come. That's one of the clear objectives. This is such an incredibly large market. You will very likely not be able to service all avenues of the market with exactly the same product. So understanding really what you think your target market is incredibly important. The other thing that's really interesting that doesn't get a lot of play is folks want to consume CBD. They find it useful in their everyday lives. And if we go all the way back and you look at, you know, normal combustion of hemp or oil tinctures, you know, it's hard to go take a smoke break in the middle of your day and smoke cannabis, especially if that's something you're not specifically interested in. And then that gave rise to the oil tinctures and unfortunately, some of the oil tinctures just don't have a very good palate to them. And then the form factor is challenging. You know, if you're pre-COVID, if you were in the office and you had to roll back from your desk and drop some oil into your mouth, everyone kind of knew what you were doing. It may not be the thing that you want to do in a public space. Some people are just conscious of that. So a lot of these brands have done a great job of putting product to the consumer that makes the consumer at ease while they consume the product. No one's going to look at you twice if you're drinking a can of Mad Tasty. It looks like sparkling water. And it's a pleasurable drink. So not only is it not weird to see someone drinking a can of beverage, it's also a delicious beverage. So I think, and along with the can folks, their products are miles ahead of other people from a positioning standpoint and a flavor perspective. So those companies all have done a really, really good job of finding their target audience, developing a product that appeals to their target audience. And then is still the best part is they're very efficacious. So it is no longer a snake oil. It's presented to the consumer in a format that is efficacious and bioavailable. So those factors all contribute, and the companies that have the biggest amount of success are the ones that do their homework up front as far as determining their market segment. You know, they're looking at branding. All of those things are first and foremost in the minds of these companies as they roll products out.
Absolutely. Maybe one additional point here on why it's so important to define your customer robustly early in the process. So the cannabis industry writ large is still a really young market, both on the CBD and on the THC side, but it's growing really quickly and becoming very, very competitive. And one of the things that we are seeing is this transition from the idea of a one-size-fits-all cannabis product, where generally a lot of companies were just making things as fast as they could and pushing them out, with the expectation that demand was so high that consumers would buy whatever they had access to. But as the market has both grown more sophisticated and more competitive, it's the companies who have really effectively defined audiences that are going to be best positioned to compete. Because if it sounds like you're taking this scattergun approach, if what you're messaging to your consumers just isn't resonating because you don't know who they are, you're going to be in a much poorer position than the people who've taken the time to deeply understand the customer and aim not just their product, but their messaging, their engagement at that specific group. So as we look ahead 5-10 years from now, in some markets, it might even be as short as kind of 2 to 3 years from now. Anticipate much more intense competition. And within that competition, the companies who have staked out their customers most effectively, I think will be the best positions to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll add to that is not only is it necessary or a requirement to identify properly your target market, most companies can always get one sale. The consumer was curious, the packaging is great, it looks cool, they'll buy it. But if they don't have a good experience with it, the likelihood of a repeat customer goes way down. So not only do you have to appeal to your target market, but then you've got to provide them a product that achieves the desired outcome. There's not going to be too many beer companies that survive if for some reason you buy a 6-pack and there's no alcohol in it. Or so if you're buying a cannabis infused drink and there's a breakdown in the formulation or in the manufacturing, or you have instability in the product, the consumer's not going to have a great experience. And the likelihood of repeat sales goes way down.
So make sure your product does what it says on the box.
Absolutely.
So understanding the market regulations before you build. This is absolutely critical because of how dynamic the regulatory environment has been in the US over the past few years. So just one example of an issue that I think has caught a number of folks by surprise is this idea that even though the 2018 Farm Bill legalized hemp nationally, there were still some markets where hemp, CBD specifically, remained illegal. 3, Idaho, Iowa, and South Dakota. And so just because you see these kind of national developments happening, are really important to understand how national, state, and local regulations impact the way you are formulating your product strategy. Because the worst thing that can happen is you're 80-90% of the way down building a product and then realize that there's something in the regulatory environment that prevents you from being able to get that product to market. Or worse still, that there's something within the way you are designing the product itself that puts it on the wrong side of the law. So Michael, I don't know how much involvement you have in kind of guiding your clients on regulatory policy, but given that you have been working in regulated environments for so long, I'd be curious just kind of in your perspective of this idea of the market regulations and the complexity of navigating them with infused products.
Sure, you literally could have an entire 2-hour conversation about the regulatory environment. Even though the Farm Bill did legalize hemp extract, FDA still gets to say whether you can put it in food and beverage. And right now they haven't given us guidelines and regulations on that matter. We'll give them a bit of a pass considering that they've had a bit of a pandemic to work through and trying to qualify vaccines and manufacture as such. But there are some states that have decided to do what the THC states have done, is they're like, we're not waiting around for the federal government. We are going to make it legal within our state. And now we're starting to see some states that are actually drafting legislation, rules, and regulations around the use of CBD in food and beverage products. I believe California is pretty close to launching theirs. I think Texas is drafting theirs currently. What I anticipate based on what we've seen in other areas, is that the FDA is likely to look at the draft guidances from California, Texas, and any other state. I think New York is looking at it as well. And they will probably, in some form, guise, or fashion, leverage some of the language and regulations that are going to go into these other states. They may sit back for a while and let it see how it plays out. But there are people out there that are like, we're not waiting for the FDA, we're launching products right now. It is the challenge that we're all behind is the fact that GW Pharma has a patent on use of CBD for juvenile diabetes, and that creates a drug. And now you have to walk back from what is a drug. But there are mechanisms in place. You can walk into your local CVS and buy, Advil, or your doctor can write you a script for prescription strength Advil, which is simply a higher milligram. Now, there's no reason that you can't take 5 tablets of OTC Advil versus 1 tablet. I have a feeling that that's likely going to be one of the main components of this regulations, is they're going to set some dosing requirements and limitations. I think that literally is the biggest hang up. The other piece that comes into play is it going to be broad, full, isolate? Those are challenges in front of the FDA. If you're not well versed in most compounds, if it's a regulated product, they have what's called a monograph. So if you look up a monograph for caffeine, for instance, it shows you the chemical structure of caffeine. It tells you what the molecular weight should be. It tells you all the tests to do on caffeine to prove that it's pure, that it is caffeine, hasn't been adulterated and such. That's going to be really, really hard to draft for a full or broad spectrum product. Because it has with it, all the other constituent components of the hemp plant. But unfortunately, GW Pharma has a patent with the isolate-based material. So now it's challenging, because what the normal route that the FDA usually follows, it can. And the regulations, even though we made it legal, it's still illegal in food and beverage until they get all these things ironed out. So it literally is a bit of a muck and a mire for the food and beverage industry, for the cannabis industry as a whole. And I think what's going to drive it is these states are tired of waiting, and they're just going to do their own thing, and then we'll go from there.
So hire good counsel as you're making your decisions on how you're going to approach this.
Exactly.
And maybe a second point there is just champion the rules that you want to see affected. This is a dynamic process. These agencies are soliciting feedback. And we have out of the EU actually a really good example of what happens when rule making could potentially go off the rails. So there was a recent announcement by the European Commission that they were recommending making CBD a narcotic, a Schedule 1 under the US Single Convention. If they did that, that would ostensibly decapitate the European hemp-derived CBD market. So a hugely consequential decision that we're waiting a final ruling on. But the fact that, in a bureaucratic environment, they're taking a very, very literalistic reading of the EU's obligations under the Single Convention, I think is just one example of why it is so important that for stakeholders who are involved in this market, champion for the rules that you want to see promulgated, because the bureaucrats may end up making decisions that undermine the opportunity that you're pursuing. So there is no Rosetta Stone when dealing with cannabinoids. Be prepared for the lack of a common language in this market, and do your homework to understand how these terms of art are being used, because it's really important to understand how, because this is such a dynamic market, both on the CBD side and on the THC side, I think there's some confusion that's being created both in the minds of the consumers, but also I think some increased risk being presented in the supply chains, because vendors may not be using, or they may be using the same words, but meaning different things. Now, the terms that I think you commonly hear are things like hemp extract, hemp seed oil, full spectrum, broad spectrum, blends, isolates. And sometimes it's, some folks may be talking about one when they mean another, and this remains an environment where the rules have not yet been set. On the left of your screen there, you see just some of the headlines I've pulled where people are really trying to explain this, and there are pages and pages and pages of these types of content of folks trying to provide some explanations, some of which are actually contradictory and wrong. So Michael, on this idea of there not being a Rosetta Stone, how should product innovators think about making sure that they're asking for the right things for the products that they want, and kind of understanding what some of these terms actually mean?
Sure, it's a really interesting dynamic that is not necessarily typical in your standard food and beverage space. Everyone understands fiber or protein or salt or calories or sugars. Without this uniform standardization of nomenclature, there's a lot of confusion, and it's confusing at many areas of the business. So you have extractors not all classifying their materials the same. Because there is no standardization, they can call it essentially what they want. Most people understand what isolate is, and I haven't seen any broad spectrum being sold as isolate, but I do see a lot of full spectrum and broad spectrum products being sold or marketed as an interchangeable. And at least the NSF certification, what they've attempted to do is sort of standardize some of this nomenclature. It's free, it's out there. They have a really nice document on what they think the different terminology means. So that's one piece. The other piece is you have a lot of confusion in the marketplace. So our customer base is not necessarily as knowledgeable as we might hope they would be. And it's our job as part of the cannabis industry, and as your job as a brand, to help educate consumers. So a lot of the successful companies are doing things where they do a lot of consumer education on the website. Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're using. Here's why it's better than this. Here's some links to some papers. Here's some reports. So I think that is going to be a huge component for anybody that's looking at getting into the market. Is you're going to have to do a lot of consumer education, and then it falls down to labeling too. When the product hits the market shelves, we've seen someone adding just hemp seed oil to water and calling it hemp water. Well, great, but you've literally done that to sort of hoodwink the consumer and to think that you haven't called out CBD, but the consumer thinks that they're getting CBD. And so until there's some rules and regulations around what you can and can't say on the label, that unfortunately will continue. So I think some of it is, consumer facing. The brands need to educate the consumer. The industry as a whole really needs to start working on adopting some standardized nomenclature, and then we will look to the government or whatever, it's the state or the federal level, to institute some labeling standards. I mean, we have great nutritional labeling standards that here's the rules, everybody plays by the same thing. We'd like to see that continue on in the cannabis space.
So then perhaps an unfair question for you, and thank you for that. As if somebody comes up to you and says, I'm trying to come up with a new infused beverage, should I use broad, full, or isolate to make this product? What would your counsel be?
It's a really interesting question. Some people already have a predetermined that they want to use a broad spectrum product, for instance.
And maybe actually for the user, for the attendees that we have here who may not actually be aware of what these terms mean, could you just give a quick thumbnail on the difference between full, broad, and isolate?
Yeah, the real broad strokes, SōRSE considers full spectrum to be essentially what was derived from the plant, maybe minus waxes. It's still going to contain some level of THC. In many cases, it's an illegally high percentage of THC. And once that product is remediated, the THC is lowered down, then we refer to that as broad spectrum. That's not always the case in the industry, but that's just how when we look at it, we will not work with anything that is not compliant with the language of the law, which is that has to be less than 0.3% THC. We have taken the stance that anything higher than 0.3% does not meet the rules and the regulations set forth, and theoretically could be construed as an illegal product. Many people like the whole plant perspective of broad spectrum. So you still get your terpenes, you know, your flavonoids, you get your mixed bag of cannabinoids based on the genetics of the plant. Isolate was essentially is just CBD. I think the certification lists broad spectrum as like 70%, and then 30% is the rest of the stuff in the plant. But we really don't know where the government's going to fall, where the FDA is going to fall yet. If you look at it from a monograph perspective, they would prefer isolate. But the industry is shifted, and the consumer base is mostly shifted to broad spectrum with the thought that you get more therapeutic benefits from a whole plant perspective. We have folks that are literally developing exactly the same product with both an isolate and a broad spectrum, so that they can get their product development done and then just wait for the FDA to weigh in on whichever one they are going to settle on. Some folks are, you know, obviously isolate carries with it the lowest sensory threshold. So if you're trying to do an incredibly delicate flavor system and you don't want any traces of cannabinoid flavor, then isolate is usually the best for those folks. If you have a more dynamic system and you're adding some sensory notes, savory notes, broad spectrum, we can hide that. And then it goes along, the corollary is it goes along with dosage. So you can hide a 5 milligram dose a lot better than you can hide a 50 milligram dose as far as sensory. So really, some people come to us knowing exactly what they want to do. Some people are looking for guidance. Some people are doing a mixed bag and trying a whole bunch of stuff and seeing where the FDA may side.
So be prepared for a bit of trial and error. So a really, I think, important part of building an infused product is in selecting your infusion partner, where you're sourcing your cannabinoids from, because there's quite a few things Michael has already said. I've shown not all cannabinoids are created equal. Not everyone is operating by the same rules. So, you know, and I'm comfortable with using this as a chance to just kind of advertise SōRSE, but I'd love for you to talk about, you know, what makes SōRSE's cannabinoid approach different from what you tend to see in the market, and why is that really important when you're building infused products? You know, how has the technology, how has the innovation made it possible to build more elegant products than what we used to see on the market?
Sure, that was one of the foundational pieces to the creation of SōRSE. Is that inside the cannabis space, there are a lot of people. It is a bit of a gold rush from the start, and it still is to today a bit of a gold rush. So you'll have folks that got into the market at different areas that not necessarily well versed in manufacturing setups, quality standards, you know, safety testing, those type of attributes that you normally associate with more developed food and beverage industries or pharmaceutical or medical device industries. So to that end, SōRSE brought in and recruited folks that had that experience. So most of the science team and engineering team comes out of regulated markets, whether they be previous food and beverage experience, pharmaceutical experience, device. So we have on staff an understanding of the most critical attributes. You can't walk into a large CPG company and not have all of everything that you need to go from a quality and regulatory standpoint. I mean, you better have a HACCP plan. You better have, you know, your allergen statements. You better have all the associated documents that those companies are going to request as part of making a safe product. So SōRSE really said that we are going to build products that are as safe and as most efficacious as possible. So to that end, the pictures you see, it would be great if it was live, but This is one of our powderized products. It's a standard, essentially CBD powder is the one on the farthest left. That will reconstitute into a full beverage grade emulsion. And those products are great for baked goods, ice creams, hummuses, traditional food products. The other one is an agglomerated, the middle picture is an agglomerated, so that hydration rate is incredibly fast. Its utility is mostly in single serve, like stick packs. Take it with you, hydrate super fast. And to show how quickly it does hydrate, the one on the right is salt. So the powders are already hydrated and dispersed within the water column, and the salt is still sitting there waiting to dissolve. We also make exactly the same platforms in the liquid product. So liquid and powder, there's not too much that you can't make in a grocery store without a liquid or a powder. So we're aimed positioned to hit as many market verticals as possible. For folks out there that, like, I will tell you, when you're looking for a CBD supplier, just find someone that you trust. Find someone that you can build a really, really good relationship, because the hope is this is going to be a long-term play. So you wanna have a comfort level that you can get product when you want it, that it's going to have all the requisite information with it, that the appropriate safety protocols and standards are applied during the manufacturing process. Certain market verticals are looking for all natural, organic, or kosher. So that is beyond the scope of what some people that are just getting into the business are capable of doing or are knowledgeable about. And we're always telling folks that, like, we just want you to have a good experience with the cannabis industry. The cannabis industry is a wonderful, huge opportunity for all of us. We just don't want anyone through ill intent or non-ill intent to give the industry as a whole black eye. It's still an up and coming industry. We want everyone to get safe products and have safe products to the consumer, and do your due diligence to make sure that your supplier, whoever it is, can tick off all the boxes that need to.
And can't stress that enough. For the rising cost of developing and innovating new products in this space, you don't want to have to get to the end of the line and then realize that because of the partner that you've approached, because of the counsel that you've received, you've brought something to market that won't sell. So really worth investing in that due diligence as you're making the decisions in who your partners are going to be early on. So I loved putting this slide together just because I just continue to marvel at the spectrum of products which we're seeing infused with cannabinoids. Some of these are SōRSE partners, including Heirloom Pets, Cedar Wellness, Rip and Sip and Center. And others are just really successful infused products, including Lord Jones, which has been a multi-award winning edibles crop, Velo Bar, which recently won Men's Health Best CBD infused protein bar. So really, really rich diversity of products. And I think a great illustration of this transition or movement toward this concept that we've been calling CBD everywhere, where you increasingly start to see cannabinoid infused products replicating the products that we see across the broad consumer economy. So maybe a slightly different question than I actually had intended to ask you on this one, Michael, but which products have you been most excited to work on or just found most interesting from an R&D, from a development or from an approach to market concept, given how rich this portfolio of clients that you've worked with has become?
Yeah, we've had the pleasure to work with a number of different really innovative brands that are coming up with some really, really unique market segments, essentially. I would say there's literally, I usually tend to get a little bit excited about most of the products just because they're all uniquely different. There's some products that are coming to a big box retailer near you, probably Q1 of next year. that was a very, very exciting project to work on, because it not only it was CBD focused, but also had a number of different therapeutics in it. So getting all of those therapeutics along with cannabis into a small format was a really, really challenging endeavor, and really exciting to see come to fruition. I think I like the title of this, like, I think the one piece that we see most often where people forget or don't think about is when you're doing food and beverage products, no one's going to actually measure the salt content of your beverage, or no one's going to measure the actual caloric content. And if you do do a nutritional assay, you're given some latitude and wiggle room. So no one's going to be upset if they actually get 4.5 calories in a drink instead of 5, or conversely 6. But most, if not all, of these products eventually will be subject to analysis. And much like the pharmaceutical industry, if you have a label claim that says 20 milligrams, someone's going to test it, and you better have 20 milligrams in there. And that for most people is that, even if the folks that have food and beverage experience, that's a little bit of a left turn for them, because they never have to worry about lot to lot variation on really, really subtle changes in, it could be flavor or color or nutrients, whatever the material is. You're given an acceptable amount of leeway, and most consumers aren't going to notice. But in this space, 20 better be 20 and not 15, or you're going to find it. The world, unfortunately, is a very litigious place. That is for far and away most people the biggest hurdle, is getting a clear understanding that you are essentially claiming milligrams of product in there. And when you're making thousands and thousands and thousands of these things, you better figure out how to make sure that you get exactly the same dose in every single product.
Absolutely. And particularly given that we're seeing the rise in litigation around false claims in this space, definitely something that you don't want to get caught on the wrong side of. Now, this conversation has been going great. I want to set a couple of housekeeping things. One, please continue to pop your questions in. Two, Michael has said he is going to be available to stick around for questions following our regular time. So for those of you who have not had your questions answered, fear not. As we do with many of our webinars, we'll do an additional, say, 20 minutes of extra time after the end of the hour, after the top of the hour, just so we can get through as many additional questions as possible. So please continue to put your questions in. I see a few people have raised their hands. Again, we're not going to be taking oral questions, so please do make sure to input your questions in that Q&A interface. I've been reading a few of them here as we go along, and I'll continue to do that as we have this conversation. So maybe just a closing kind of frame before we get deep into the Q&A, Michael, is this idea about iterating and innovating to continue to serve the market's evolving needs. One of the things that I've just been most excited by in the work that we do, which is tracking the evolution of the cannabinoid consumer, is, for example, observing this kind of transition in the way we as an industry think about consumers, moving from what was this monolithic definition, you're either a cannabis consumer or you're not, to then becoming a binary of you're either a med consumer or you're a rec consumer or you're not, to then evolving into the kind of cannabis consumer archetyping that we've done on the THC side, or even as you see on screen, just taking this question of why do you use CBD and disaggregating all of the different reasons and why people use CBD as a way to understand what sort of products might appeal to them. So finding that there are 4 broad groups, those who are using it to unwind, for pain, for general wellness, or for medical. But even within the unwinding, general wellness, and medical groups, you see a lot of diversity there. So Michael, from your stance, as you see both the way our understanding of the consumer is evolving, as well as the way the technologies around infusion are evolving, kind of what do you think lies ahead? What do you think is coming down the pike, and how should innovators who are looking at opportunities in the space start to kind of plant the seed for a future of advanced product development based on everything we're learning?
Sure. This is a really interesting dynamic to watch in generally an incredibly short period of time. Initially, it was all about CBD. You know, a beverage of 20 milligrams of CBD, and now the market is fairly saturated with straight CBD products. And what we're starting to see and is a really the growth of a very specific targeted therapeutic. So rather than an overarching take CBD, it's good for so many things, is that folks are starting to craft, like you may have a morning beverage that has perhaps just straight CBD in it, but it also has caffeine or vitamin C, and that's your wake up, rise, get ready for the day. Um, I can tolerate the commute or the public transport or the day in my home office with a little CBD. And then during the day, maybe it's just a straight product, but it's something that you could consume like regularly. So it's not a super strong or odd flavor. It's something that you would normally gravitate to, that you could have two or three products, whether they're edibles or beverages, during the middle of the day. And then you get into some boutique things. Folks are looking at like a nighttime product, which would maybe be CBD, and now you're adding CBN to help, promote that restful sleep, and then they'll add into that compounds, or they'll use like a chamomile base or a melatonin or something that already has predicate use as a sleep aid in concert with CBD and CBN. So I think the evolution is now targeted therapeutics with unique combinations of CBD and any of the other isomers, whether it's CBV or CBG or CBN, along with adaptogens or other different therapeutic compounds. It's really very quickly becoming a pretty sophisticated approach to developing a specific product.
Innovation abounds. So we're a couple of minutes off from the top of the hour, so I want to do a couple of things real quick. We'll come back for the discussion and answer all of your questions, but first I do want to share our poll results, which we began the webinar by asking which market verticals you are currently involved in. You should be all seeing the results on your screen now. Good diversity. Most of you, 80%, are involved in CBD, about half involved in THC, 54, but also some who are involved in minor cannabinoids and industrial hemp. In what sectors of the industry are you involved? Really good diversity of folks here. But the polarity were involved in processing, which makes sense given that this is involved. This is a discussion about infused product development, but also fair representation, about 1/5 in both in cultivation, about 1/3 in retail, and yeah, roughly about 1/5 both in ancillary products and services. Product categories that you're involved in, about half of you are involved in beverages, which makes sense. I think you've got a perfect guide through that ecosystem with Michael here, and 30% in solid edibles. Impact of the COVID pandemic on demand for infused products. So if you take the increase, significantly increase slightly, you actually have the preponderance of the answers. You have well over 80%, just over 80% there, or around 80% involved in both, which I think is reflected in the data that we're seeing, both in the, I think, concern about smoking, but also just interest in different consumption forms now that people are spending a lot more time at home and consuming different contexts. And then what is the most important factor in developing an infused product? 64% say quality. I think based on everything we've discussed today, Michael would agree with that. But it is important to understand that all of these other issues, pricing, your marketing and branding strategy, your speed to market, and critically understanding your consumer are all also really, really important. So having a really high quality product that's not aimed at the wrong consumer isn't going to serve you well, and really important that you think about this market in its totality. So thank you for everyone who participated in that poll. Always great to see who we have on, participating here and to see your perspectives. And before we transition back to Q&A, I just want to also, I'll put up Michael's contact information for a quick second, as I thank you, Michael, for your phenomenal perspective here. Really, really appreciate the depth of expertise that you bring to this. And I can't wait to hear your perspective as we walk through some of the great questions that we have from our audience. But thank you to you, thank you to the SōRSE team for being phenomenal partners through this process. It's been a phenomenal collaboration, and I hope everyone will benefit from it by making sure you get a copy of this report, Cannabis Infused Products, Navigating the Complexities to Market. You can download your copy at newfrontieردata.com. It's chock-a-block with everything here that we've discussed and quite a bit more. So make sure to get your copy at newfrontieردata.com/acqueo. So good, I think a good stopping point for the top of the hour. Now let's get into the Q&A. While we're going through the Q&A, I'll put up Michael's contact information for just a bit longer as I go through the first couple of questions here. First, just on the housekeeping, yes, we will be making all of the, we'll be making both the slides and the a copy of the recording available to all registrants. An interesting question here, and I thought this was compelling. Michael, Jean Rousseau is asking, you know, a CBD infused product doesn't provide a high. So how is a consumer supposed to know when it's working, quote unquote?
That is an exceptionally interesting question. It's on the THC side, it's real easy to know. On the CBD side, it is challenging to know. There isn't an association with necessarily an output or a feeling that you get. The way I've walked some of my clients or even some of my personal friends through this is that what we do is we get a bunch of products that are, and then I'll say, you know, day one, drink 1 can of CBD infused beverage. Day 2, drink 2. Day 3, drink 3. And then you build up your own, you have to figure out how it's impacting you. Can you discern any differences based on the way you feel? It's a really interesting dynamic, because what most people are unaware of is that every human being contains an endogenous cannabinoid system. So your body actually makes cannabinoids, but it only does that in response to a stressor. So let's say you're running and you sprain your ankle. Believe it or not, your body will make endogenous cannabinoids, and those cannabinoids in an injury are intended to do a couple things. You know, reduce inflammation, start to work on the central nervous system to mitigate some of the pain. So it's hard for people, like if I wake up and I'm not necessarily super stressed, and I'm not in pain, is it really doing anything for me? The other piece for that is that people will ingest or consume CBD infused products where the CBD is not presented in a way that the body can work on it and uptake. One of the big challenges with taking straight CBD oil is it is oil. If you have a huge breakfast in the morning and then you take your CBD oil, it may sit on top of the stomach contents for some period of time before your body can empty the stomach and the CBD now enters the intestinal tract for absorption. So in one hand, you like, I don't feel anything. Well, it's not actually in your body yet, you know? So it's hard. So are you getting the wrong format? Are you not taking enough? Or are you in a state of stasis where the CBD is essentially that, you know, the cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system intent is to provide stasis. So when you're stressed, it helps relax you. When you're hurt, it helps you heal. When you're tired, it helps you sleep. So if you're not in a super stressed environment, it may not feel like it does anything for you. But I can tell you, if you get used to taking it, you'll know the day you don't. And that's the easiest way I can tell people to experience it is get on a routine, get something that you can get a dosage that you feel, and then stop taking it. And you'll know. I think the biggest one that I hear all the time is that if you take CBD before you work out, a half hour to an hour before you work out, people are reporting that they can work out more vigorously and for a longer duration than they normally could. They don't necessarily ascribe that to any particular sensation. They just seem to be able to work out more. And then the same folks after their monster leg day, where in the next morning you can't walk down the stairs, the people are reporting, I feel so much better in the morning, even after a huge workout. I never could do that before. So are you necessarily going to feel it? Maybe, maybe not. But are you going to feel the effects of the things that it's doing for you? Very likely.
Great answer, and perhaps an important lesson there about this being about knowing your body in terms of the, being able to understand how this effects are, and because it's not getting you elevated, it's not getting you high. This is much more about dialing in processes, dialing in systems. May not be quite as pronounced as you would expect it to be. Really insightful. What's your take, Michael, on the future of sublinguals, of dissolvable products? So here we're talking about, rather than things that you ingest and swallow, things that dissolve quickly under the tongue or kind of in the oral, and are absorbed by the mucosa.
Yeah, that's a really interesting product segment, if you will. The one thing that we get a lot of requests for, like what dissolvable thin strip or a dissolvable tablet, a sublinguals. Your homework assignment is to go to CVS or Walgreens or whatever your family neighborhood pharmacy is, and ask the pharmacist how many sublinguals he has behind the counter. Very, very few. And the biggest reason is the absorption rate is really not good. You can go and look, the studies out there, you just don't get a really good absorption rate. Now, are you going to get the effects? Yes, but it's not necessarily tied to just the sublingual absorption. It's the fact that what you're not absorbing, you're swallowing. And that's how you get the effects. But the absorption rate directly through the tongue and the mucosal membranes is not sufficiently good enough to get what you would do as a healthy dose. So there's a lot of interest. It's a cool format, no question about it. Are you going to get the effects of CBD? Yes, but it's a side effect of you actually ingesting. If you took a sublingual tablet and you didn't swallow anything and then you spit it all out, you would not necessarily get a healthy dose. And we see that in pharmacokinetic studies where the amount of cannabinoids in the bloodstream is not sufficient really to affect the positive outcome for the consumer.
So maybe a good cautionary tale there. Test out the products that are already on the market as you're trying to pick the product form. There's a lot of science that's being done around these product forms in other markets, so not necessarily in cannabis, that I think can give you a good guide on how effective they might be for your cannabis-based platform. A question here about nanotechnologies and the safety profile of nanotech in infused product formulation. I don't know whether that's something that you and the SōRSE side are doing, but I'm curious just on your take on nanotech, or more broadly, I think, what you think some of the next gen developments in infusion innovation are going to be.
Yeah, it's an interesting word. A lot of times people throw around nanotechnology because it's cool. Tech is cool. The particle sizes are sufficiently small. And there's some anecdotal thoughts that decreasing the particle size will increase the rate of absorption and the total amount of absorption. Cautionary tale that certain regulatory bodies are not fond of certain vernaculars, specifically because at certain particle sizes, once the particle size is of a certain size, it has the ability to first enter the cell. And in the world of pharmaceuticals, that's a wee bit of a problem because they tend to aggregate in many places where you don't necessarily want them aggregating. If you get them sufficiently small, sub 100 nanometers or so, around 80 nanometers, studies have shown that the particles are sufficiently small that can enter the cell nuclei. That's not a good thing. And you want to make sure that the product is not aggregating where you don't want it crossing the blood-brain barrier. These are things that if this becomes a fully regulated FDA market, some of those things are going to be looked at. So while it is really cool and it's really neat and it's, we can make really small stuff, we're a little trepidatious about any pending regulations around particle size. I'll just leave it at that.
So, nano infusion technology user beware. It's a complex market.
Yeah, and I'll just throw out that we do not market and sell anything that we term as nano. We're very cautious about that. We have fantastic PK studies that can show you that our particle size does exactly what it's supposed to do and not have to tread into areas where we don't want to.
Since I think everyone has had a chance now, Michael, to get your contact information, I thought we may as well just get off the slide deck and go full screen. Two-part question here from Alison Rowe. Is it possible to infuse dry ground, such as tea, with liquid distillate? And I think we know the answer to that, but what equipment manufacturer supplies the tools required to infuse? And I think we're speaking to them. So talk maybe a little bit about this idea of infusing dry powders that would be then mixed by the consumer at home. But that's, and I saw a couple of questions here about teas specifically, what that process looks like or how it might differentiate from infusing liquid into set cans or shots that are pre-blended before they get to the consumer.
Sure. So we typically handle markets such as tea a couple different ways. If you're doing a dry tea, if you're doing a sachet, we typically will add the CBD powder to the tea or the tea blends, then fill the sachets. And then when the consumer steeps their bag or the sachet, the powder rehydrates, forms the beverage grade emulsion again, and then infuses the product. That's the simplest and most elegant route. So you get a 15 milligram tea bag or a 20 milligram tea bag. The other approach is to sell a side. I think one of the images you showed was the Rip and Sip product, which is a liquid emulsion, and some companies are selling that as an add-on to their product portfolio. So you steep the tea bag as normal and then add the liquid. You don't necessarily have to. I know certain tea companies will spray flavors onto their tea leaves and then tumble them to infuse specific flavors onto black tea, for instance. We don't worry about trying to do that. It's just it's simpler and easier to not have to have folks add a different manufacturing step. What we try and do is provide products to folks that can use them in the way that they're already using their current standard products. So if you're dry blending tea, then just throw some powder in there and fill your sachets as normal. That's usually the simplest and easiest route.
So that's on just kind of a pure ratio. If you have your 10 pounds of tea, you'll add your 1 pound of CBD infusion, blend it together, make sure it's uniformly dispersed, and then pack your sachets from there.
Mm-hmm.
Good. So hopefully that answered your question, Alison. From Michael Kurzog, and we've had a couple of questions specifically around topicals. One, maybe starting at the macro level, kind of what's your take? Why do you think the cosmetics industry is now starting to pay so much more attention to CBD infusion? We've seen Sephora come to market with a couple of products, supermodels like Kathy Ireland starting to come up with cannabinoid infused products. So it's still nascent, it's a smaller part of this broader ecosystem, but certainly something that seems to be gaining traction. And so, yeah, I'd love your perspective specifically on the cosmetic side, and then maybe we'll have a second part around topicals more broadly.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, and it's a very efficacious mode of getting your CBD. The way I look at it is, let's say you've sprained your wrist, and while you could take 60, whatever the milligram dosage is that makes you feel better from a sprained wrist, but you're putting the CBD and you've got to sort of carpet bomb your whole body to get the dose to essentially your wrist. Or you could just use a topical and put the CBD infusion directly onto the site that's bothering you the most. So, and there's two primary receptors associated with cannabinoids. The primary one is more internal on the central nervous system, but there are a lot of cannabinoid receptors actually in the skin. So as long as you can present the cannabinoids to those receptors at your skin level, you can get an efficacious dose. It's a very viable platform. It's a great way to go. I routinely have CBD topicals. If I use them quite often. They work great. It's a great product form. They work great. Yeah, I anticipate seeing that market segment grow quite a bit.
So I think that maybe part of Michelle's concern there was that she was going to need a lot of it because the absorption rate might not be there. But Michael, it sounds like from your answer that that's actually not a risk. That the skin-based approach is really effective delivery mechanism. So Michelle, hopefully that should help you keep your production costs low. Yeah,
and I can give you a real world example for that. There's a cream that just came off prescription, Voltaren, which is an ibuprofen infused topical. You can deliver to the site of inflammation or pain that mechanism a much higher dose of ibuprofen. It would actually be almost slightly toxic to ingest that much, but you can topically apply it and it works great. So that it is a very viable platform. It's been proven time and time again. You can get away with a much higher dose in the lotion or topical or cream than you would necessarily want to ingest.
I have to talk a bit about pets because the CBD pet market is something that we've been very interested and fascinated to see just kind of explode into the scene and see the way pet owners have really embraced this category. So we know that Heirloom Pet Products is one of your clients, and I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on what you're hearing from them or their pet or from pet owners around what the effect of having a CBD infused pet product does for the animals who are consuming it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I originally would have never thought it, but it's working great. There are a lot of folks that will talk about that their dog they get very anxious, or it's jittery, or perhaps it's a advanced age where it's starting to have some mobility issues, whether it's hips or joints. And people are using it for a wide variety of I have a friend who dog, every time there's a thunderstorm, he essentially tries to rip the door down to get out of the house. And ever since they've been putting some CBD in their dog food, he's gone through a ton of thunderstorms, like no problem. Folks are using it for, reduce or create a better quality of life for their pets, and in across multiple ways. It's all worked great.
Yeah, we definitely think that given the broader dramatic surge that we've seen over the past 10 years in pet spending, and particularly now that people are home more, I think you've all seen the headlines around, dog shelters, animal shelters being completely picked clean as pet lovers come through to adopt animals during this period of COVID. I think we're actually going to see a dramatic increase in pet-based spending in the time ahead. And given all of the stresses associated with this new COVID environment, or with this COVID environment specifically, I do think that that's a category that is going to be that was already poised for strong growth, but is going to see that growth accelerated because of the broader environment in which we're in. Speaking about COVID, Michael, we began the conversation, actually, we were talking about this just before the session began, about some of the kind of consumption changes that we're seeing in a post-COVID world. On the THC side, it's almost like the end of puff, puff, pass. It's, puff, puff, get your own. We're seeing a lot more interest in infused products, a category which have performed really well. Would love your perspective on just strategically what you think this moment, this singular moment that we're in, presents for infused products for entrepreneurs who might be looking at this space, and some of the considerations that they should take into account given the changes in cannabinoid consumption that we've seen that have been borne by social distancing, by the health concerns, etc. So just your take on infused products in the age of COVID.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like we were talking that, in the THC side, it used to be very common to, when you're being social, to sort of pass it around. Now no one's going to drag on a joint that someone else just had in their mouth. But it also presents a unique environment in both THC and CBD, is that people are curious and they want to try stuff. It's hard to do that on an inhalation without some extraordinary ancillary features or equipment you might need. But it's cool. Like I've seen folks that have like CBD parties where everyone brings a different product, and they will, if they're gummies, they share the gummies. If they're drinks, they just pour them across and they share the drinks. It's a really kind of a neat way to socially distant, of course, to get together and try products where you don't feel like, oh, well, if you walk in and you don't know the product, you've never experienced CBD, you've never tried this particular brand, do you really want to spend X amount of dollars for a 6-pack of this stuff? Well, if I bought a 6-pack and then all of our friends could buy and try different products, and we were like, we really like this one, or this one works really great. So it's interesting. So one of the things people tend to gravitate and say, hey, I want to do a 15 milligram beverage. Well, some people may not want to do 15 milligrams. And no one really likes to drink half of a canned product. So we always say, like, when you're starting out, sometimes maybe build a couple different levels. You may have the same flavor platform, but it would be cool to have a 15 milligram beverage and a 30 milligram beverage. And then as your consumer base changes and evolves, well, what people will do is they'll try a little bit of a low dose just to make sure it doesn't get them high or they don't feel weird or anything. And then they get used to it, they like it, they'll start graduating to and I think, my hat's off to the oil tincture guys. They figured this out a long time ago. You start them at, 300-400 milligrams in a tincture, you walk it up to 1,800 plus milligrams. And people will start at the low dose and then walk up as they get used to it and they understand more about it and they learn what their dosage is. We don't see that so much in the food and beverage space. But Center Brands does 2 different models or 2 different strengths, and it really has done well for them. So like give your customers the opportunity to sort of segue into the market, and then once they're hooked, they'll keep gravitating to the larger ones. Because the other thing to pay attention to is do your homework when you're in the marketplace. Consumers are starting to get savvy based on the price point per milligram. So if a 20 milligram beverage is $5 and a 25 milligram beverage is $8, most people are going to buy the 20 milligram because they're like, its cost per milligram is X. So, that's another thing that people don't do enough homework is when they're out in the marketplace. See what's out there, see what people are selling it for, see which products are moving. And then your sweet spot is.
Sure. Just a quick clarification here to Jean Rousseau. Yes, we have been talking quite a bit about CBD, but SōRSE does work with THC and other cannabinoids. As Michael said at the beginning, the platform is compound agnostic. And so maybe a quick question just around the rise of the minor cannabinoids. You talked a bit about this just as we were closing the top of the hour, but I'd love for you to pick that thread in what you're seeing in terms of whether it is compounds or products being made with minor cannabinoids alone, or whether it is CBD or THC plus these minor cannabinoids or other cannabis compounds.
Sure. I haven't seen too many products out there that are a minor cannabinoid only. And usually the reason for that is right now it's just simply cost. A lot of the minors, whether it's CBG or CBV, tend to be a good bit more expensive than CBD. And what we're seeing in some of the academic research is that those minor compounds are essentially very effective at lower levels. So they don't see any increased benefit for, CPG at, 20% versus 40%. At a lower percentage, it all comes back to the terminology that comes out of the THC space, which is the entourage effect. And, for the entourage effect, 1 + 1 = 3, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
If you have CPG and CBD, those two cannabinoids together has a higher therapeutic benefit than either one alone. And the good thing with the minors is that we can add them at lower percentages. They're still very effective at lower percentages, and that helps mitigate the product cost. But yeah, like that I think is there are people that are studying the effects of each individual minor cannabinoid, and then folks that are studying blends of cannabinoids. But yeah, it's a really interesting topic. It's a really new area. People are just really getting their feet under them and doing all the work. But yeah, I would say if you're interested in that route, you do your research, because you probably don't need a lot of the minors.
And just a point for everyone, because we've had so many questions here, Michael. I think we could keep you on for another 3 hours, but I promised I would not do that. So for everyone who is still on, thank you so much for all of the questions. For those whose questions we've not had a chance to get to, we're going to take the questions down and make sure that we follow up with you, because this is clearly an area that we could continue to go down the rabbit hole. I want to give Michael back at least some of his afternoon. So maybe, Michael, one final question. What's next? As you think about the future of infused products, what should people who are coming into the space now really be thinking about and planning for as this market opportunity continues to evolve?
Yeah, I think for me, it's interesting to look back. When you look back at the market, everyone was just rushing to, CBD infused gummies, CBD infused brownies, and chocolate chip cookies, and sugary drinks. None of those things scream health and wellness to me. And now you're starting to see that evolution into, hey, I've got this health and wellness material. I would probably be better served to put it in a health and wellness product. So like those protein bars are a perfect example of, that's a great utility of CBD. The one thing that I say it a lot to all the brands, I was like, if you're looking to differentiate yourselves, go look for a CBD infused RTD protein beverage. I guarantee you, if you make that, the market is there. like I've seen, at gyms, the bars, the smoothie bars will have sometimes a CBD add-on, but
Mhm.
for most people, like I would gravitate to, hummus, guacamole, health and wellness products that you feel good about eating, you feel good about, like I don't want to get my CBD through a chocolate chip cookie. As good as that might be, um, but the protein beverages, all of those things, I think that's what's next, is that we've now put CBD into the market and we've got it in front of consumers. Now we really need to tie all those loose ends together and say, this is a health and wellness product. It should pair perfectly with a health and wellness food or beverage
I think that's a perfect instruction to our attendees is, now that it is out there, think deeply about what's the best fit, best use case for this market. And if this is, well, a health and wellness focused addition to the product itself, the underlying product into which it's being infused, should have that orientation as well. Again, to our attendees, everything that we've discussed here today and more is covered in this report, Navigating the Complexities to Market of Cannabis-Infused Products, the latest that has been produced in this phenomenal partnership with SōRSE Technologies, or SōRSE Technology. I'm going to put up Michael's contact information just so that is up again, but thank you to everyone who has attended this conversation. Michael, thank you. I was challenged to try and stump you through as we were setting this up, and I tried my darndest, and you handled this with aplomb. So thank you for your phenomenal insights, for your deeply rich perspective, and more broadly, thank you to you and the SōRSE team for being extraordinary partners through this process. We've received just phenomenal feedback from the series, both from the reports and from the webinars. Innovators, entrepreneurs, brands saying they've gotten a lot of value from the insights that they've gained from your perspectives and from your contributions to these conversations. So to the SōRSE team, thank you for the partnership. To Michael, thank you again for the phenomenal insights. And to our attendees, we look forward to seeing you at our next cannabis webinar. And then until then, please be safe, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other. Thank you all.